Eric Parker woke up to a typical morning in his small, quiet town. The early sunlight filtered through the curtains of his modest home, illuminating the room he shared with his wife, Emily. Their life was far from extravagant, but it was peaceful. Eric was a hard-working mechanic, known around town for his skill with engines and his unshakable work ethic. This particular morning, as he stretched and swung his legs out of bed, he noticed something odd on the middle finger of his right hand. Small, perfectly round spots dotted his skin, their reddish hue stark against his pale complexion. They didn't hurt, but their appearance was unusual enough to catch his attention. "Emily," he called, walking into the kitchen where his wife was pouring coffee. "Take a look at this." Emily glanced up, her brow furrowing as she set down the mug. "What is it?" Eric held out his hand. "These spots. They just showed up overnight." Emily leaned in for a closer look, her eyes narrowing. "Have you been working with anything strange at the shop? Chemicals or solvents?" "Nothing out of the ordinary," Eric replied, shaking his head. "Just the usual oil and grease." Emily bit her lip, concern flickering across her face. "Maybe you should get it checked out. It could be an allergic reaction or something serious." Eric shrugged, brushing off her worry. "It's probably nothing. I'll keep an eye on it." With that, he kissed her cheek and headed out the door. The drive to the auto repair shop was uneventful, the familiar hum of the engine soothing his nerves. As he pulled into the parking lot, he waved to his coworker, Dave, who was unloading parts from a delivery truck. "Morning, Parker." Dave called, tossing a wrench into his toolbox. "What's up?" "Not much," Eric replied, holding up his hand. "Except for these weird spots. Ever seen anything like it?" Dave took a look, then let out a low whistle. "Man, that's creepy. You sure you didn't touch something toxic?" Eric chuckled. "Not that I know of. Probably just a rash." The day passed uneventfully, with Eric focused on repairing a series of cars that came through the shop. By lunchtime, he'd almost forgotten about the spots. But as the afternoon wore on, he began to feel an odd tingling sensation in his fingers. When he glanced down, he noticed the spots had spread, now appearing on his other fingers as well. By the time he returned home that evening, the tingling had turned into a persistent itch. Emily greeted him at the door, her face lighting up before quickly darkening with concern. "They've spread," she said, her voice laced with alarm. "Eric, this isn't normal. You need to see a doctor." Eric sighed, his reluctance evident. He hated going to the doctor, viewing it as an unnecessary hassle. But Emily's persistence wore him down, and he finally agreed to visit the clinic the next morning. The local clinic was a small, no-frills operation, staffed by a handful of doctors and nurses who knew most of their patients by name. Dr. Grant, an experienced and somewhat gruff physician, examined Eric's hand with a critical eye. "Any pain?" the doctor asked, prodding the spots with a gloved finger. "No, just some itching," Eric replied. Dr. Grant nodded, jotting down notes. "Have you been exposed to any unusual substances? Pesticides, cleaning agents, anything like that?" "Nothing that comes to mind," Eric said. "Just my usual work at the shop." The doctor ordered a series of blood tests and a skin biopsy, assuring Eric that they were likely dealing with a minor allergic reaction or a fungal infection. "We'll have the results in a few days," he said. "In the meantime, avoid scratching and keep the area clean." Eric left the clinic feeling mildly reassured, though Emily remained uneasy. She insisted on applying an antiseptic cream to his hands and wrapping them in bandages, a precaution that Eric found excessive but indulged to ease her mind. 2 days later, Eric received an unexpected call from the clinic. The nurse on the line sounded tense, her words clipped and urgent. "Mr. Parker, Dr. Grant needs to see you immediately. Can you come in today?" Eric's stomach churned as he agreed to the appointment. He couldn't shake the ominous tone in the nurse's voice. When he arrived at the clinic, Dr. Grant was waiting for him in a private room, his expression unusually grim. "Eric," the doctor began, gesturing for him to sit. "We need to talk about your test results." Eric's pulse quickened as he took a seat. "What's going on, Doc? Is it serious?" Dr. Grant hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "The tests revealed traces of a highly toxic substance in your system. It's not something you'd encounter in your everyday environment. This is unusual." Eric blinked, trying to process the information. "Toxic? What kind of substance?" The doctor leaned forward, lowering his voice. "It's a compound commonly found in industrial-grade chemicals, but it's also been linked to illegal activities. Eric, we've had to notify the authorities." The weight of the words hit Eric like a punch to the gut. "The authorities? Why?" Dr. Grant sighed. "It's protocol. When we identify a potential public health risk or criminal activity, we're required to report it. The police will want to ask you some questions." Eric left the clinic in a daze, his mind racing with questions. How had he been exposed to something so dangerous? Had someone tampered with his tools at the shop? Or was it something he'd come into contact with unknowingly? Later that evening, 2 police officers arrived at his home. They introduced themselves as Detective Harris and Officer Reed, their expressions a mix of professionalism and curiosity. "Mr. Parker," Detective Harris began, "we're here to investigate the toxic substance identified in your test results. Can you walk us through your recent activities?" Eric recounted his routine, describing his work at the shop and his interactions with co-workers. The detectives listened intently, jotting down notes and occasionally exchanging glances. "Have you received any unusual packages recently?" Officer Reed asked. Eric thought for a moment, then nodded. "A few weeks ago, a package arrived at the shop addressed to me. I didn't order anything, so I left it in the storage room, unopened." The detectives exchanged a look, their interest clearly piqued. "We'll need to see that package," Detective Harris said. The following day, the police arrived at the auto shop with a search warrant. Eric's co-workers watched in stunned silence as the officers combed through the storage room, eventually locating the package Eric had mentioned. Inside, they found a small vial containing a clear liquid, carefully sealed and labeled with a series of cryptic numbers. The discovery sent shockwaves through the shop, sparking rumors and speculation among the employees. Eric felt his world spiraling out of control. He was a simple mechanic, a man who valued hard work and honesty. How had his life become the center of a police investigation? As he stood outside the shop, watching the officers load the evidence into their vehicle, he couldn't shake the feeling that his life was about to change forever. That night, as he sat in his living room with Emily, the weight of the situation pressed down on him. "What if they think I'm involved in something illegal?" he said, his voice tinged with fear. Emily took his hand, her eyes filled with determination. "We'll face this together. You've done nothing wrong, and the truth will come out." But as the investigation deepened, Eric would soon realize that the truth was far more complex, and far more dangerous, than he could have ever imagined. The following morning, Eric Parker found himself grappling with the surreal situation unfolding around him. His once predictable life had been upended, and his thoughts raced as he struggled to make sense of it all. The package discovered at the shop was now in police custody, and Eric could only wait as the authorities pieced together the mystery surrounding the toxic substance. Emily, ever the optimist, urged him to stay calm, but even her unwavering support couldn't shake the gnawing sense of dread that had settled in his chest. Eric's day began as uneventfully as possible given the circumstances. He returned to the auto shop, greeted by a mix of sympathetic and suspicious glances from his co-workers. The rumor mill was in full swing, and he could hear snippets of hushed conversations as he walked through the garage. "Do you think he knew what was in the package?" Hard to say. Eric's always seemed like a stand-up guy. Yeah, but you never really know someone, do you? Ignoring the murmurs, Eric focused on the task at hand. A sedan with a faulty transmission demanded his attention, and for a while, he managed to lose himself in the familiar rhythm of his work. But the peace didn't last long. Just before noon, his phone buzzed with a call from Detective Harris. "Eric," the detective began, his tone serious. "We've run some preliminary tests on the substance found in the package. It's a highly potent nerve agent, the kind used in chemical warfare. This isn't just dangerous, it's lethal." Eric's stomach churned. Chemical warfare? That's insane. I've got nothing to do with anything like that. "We believe you," Harris replied. "But the fact remains that the package was addressed to you. We need to figure out why and who sent it. Have you noticed anything unusual recently? Anyone acting out of the ordinary?" Eric racked his brain, trying to recall any details that might help. "There's been nothing unusual at the shop, but I did have a disagreement with a customer a few weeks ago. He got pretty angry when I told him we couldn't get the part he needed right away. Could that mean something?" Harris sighed. "It's a long shot, but it's worth looking into. We'll need his information if you have it." Eric provided the detective with the details of the disgruntled customer, though deep down, he doubted the connection. The man had been frustrated, sure, but to leap from that to sending a deadly substance seemed absurd. As the day wore on, the tension became almost unbearable. Emily suggested they take a walk to clear their heads, and Eric reluctantly agreed. They strolled through their neighborhood, the crisp autumn air offering a brief reprieve from their worries. But even as they walked hand in hand, Eric couldn't escape the feeling that they were being watched. At first, he dismissed it as paranoia. The stress of the investigation was bound to make him jumpy. But then he noticed a black sedan parked at the corner, its tinted windows obscuring whoever was inside. The car had been there when they left the house, and now, over an hour later, it hadn't moved. "Emily," he said quietly, stopping mid-stride. "Do you see that car?" Emily followed his gaze and frowned. "The black one? What about it? I think it's been following us." Emily's expression shifted from confusion to alarm. "Eric, are you sure?" He nodded. "Let's head back home. Stay close to me." They turned back toward their house, their pace quickening. Eric couldn't shake the feeling of eyes boring into his back, but when he glanced over his shoulder, the car was gone. He tried to convince himself it was just a coincidence, but a knot of unease settled in his gut. The next morning, Eric's unease turned to outright fear when he found an envelope taped to the front door. It was unmarked, with no name or address, and the sight of it sent a chill down his spine. Emily, standing beside him, urged him to be careful. Eric carefully opened the envelope, revealing a single sheet of paper with a cryptic message written in block letters, "Stay quiet or you'll regret it." Emily gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. "Eric, what does this mean? Who would send something like this?" "I don't know," Eric said, his voice tight. "But whoever it is, they don't want me talking to the police." The message only deepened the mystery. Eric immediately called Detective Harris, who arrived at the house within the hour. The detective examined the note, his expression grim. "This changes things," Harris said. "Whoever sent this is trying to intimidate you. It's possible they see you as a loose end." "A loose end?" Emily echoed, her voice rising in panic. "Eric hasn't done anything wrong." "We know that," Harris assured her. "But the people behind this don't know what you know, or what you might say to us. We'll assign an officer to keep an eye on your house, just in case." The presence of law enforcement provided some comfort, but the fear lingered. Eric found himself constantly looking over his shoulder, his nerves fraying with each passing day. Despite the police surveillance, the sense of being watched persisted. One evening, as Eric worked late at the shop, the situation took an even darker turn. He was alone in the garage, finishing up repairs on a pickup truck, when he heard the faint sound of footsteps behind him. "Dave? Is that you?" Eric called, turning around. But the garage was empty. The only sound was the low hum of the fluorescent lights overhead. Eric shook his head, chalking it up to his imagination, and returned to his work. A moment later, the lights flickered, plunging the garage into darkness. Eric froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He fumbled for his phone, using its flashlight to illuminate the space. "Hello?" he called out, his voice echoing in the cavernous garage. No response. But then he noticed something chilling, a faint shadow moving near the back exit. Eric's instincts kicked in, and he grabbed a wrench from the workbench, holding it tightly as he approached the door. "Whoever's there, you better leave now," he warned, his voice firm despite the fear coursing through him. The shadow disappeared, and Eric heard the sound of footsteps retreating into the night. He bolted the door and immediately called the police, who arrived minutes later to search the premises. They found no sign of an intruder, but Detective Harris was visibly concerned. "Eric, this isn't a coincidence. Someone is trying to intimidate you, or worse. We need to figure out who's behind this before it escalates further." Eric nodded, his resolve hardening. He was tired of feeling like a victim, tired of the fear that had taken over his life. "What can I do to help?" he asked. Harris hesitated, then said, "We're expanding the investigation. If you notice anything, no matter how small, you need to tell us immediately." The following day, Eric received a call from the police lab with a startling revelation. The vial found in the package contained not only the nerve agent but also traces of a rare compound used in high-level industrial manufacturing. The compound was so specific that only a handful of facilities in the country had access to it. "This is a breakthrough," Harris told Eric. "We're tracing the compound to its source. If we can identify where it came from, we might be able to track down the sender." For the first time in weeks, Eric felt a glimmer of hope. But that hope was tempered by the knowledge that the people behind this were still out there, and they weren't afraid to use intimidation tactics to silence him. That night, as he lay in bed beside Emily, Eric stared at the ceiling, his mind racing. He couldn't help but wonder what he'd stumbled into. Was he simply in the wrong place at the wrong time, or was there a deeper connection he hadn't yet uncovered? The answer, he knew, would change everything. But as the days unfolded, Eric would discover that the truth was far more shocking, and far more dangerous, than he could have ever imagined. Eric awoke the next morning with a restless mind, his thoughts circling endlessly around the unfolding events. The cryptic message taped to his door, the shadowy figure at the garage, and now the startling discovery of the rare compound, every detail added to the ominous puzzle. His mind wrestled with questions that had no answers, but he knew one thing for certain: the danger was escalating. Emily's encouraging voice pulled him out of his reverie. "We'll get through this, Eric. The police are on it, and they'll figure it out." Her words were meant to reassure him, but Eric couldn't shake the feeling that they were still one step behind whoever was orchestrating this. He kissed her on the forehead, silently appreciating her steadfast support, and prepared to face another day. At the auto shop, Eric tried to bury himself in work. His co-workers gave him a wide berth, their conversations quieter than usual. He could sense their unease. Despite their attempts to act normal, the tension was palpable. Eric avoided eye contact and focused on the engine in front of him. A few hours passed in relative silence until the shop's manager, Dave, appeared at his workstation, a serious expression on his face. "Eric, you got a visitor out front," Dave said. "A visitor?" Eric wiped his hands on a rag, his brows furrowing. "Who is it?" Dave shrugged. "Didn't give a name, but he looks official. Wearing a suit and carrying a briefcase." Eric's heart skipped a beat. He left his station and made his way to the front office. Standing near the entrance was a tall man with a commanding presence. His sharp suit and neatly trimmed beard screamed authority, but there was something cold in his eyes that made Eric uneasy. "Mr. Parker?" the man asked, extending a hand. "That's me," Eric replied cautiously, shaking his hand. "I'm Agent Collins," the man said, flashing a badge that confirmed he was with a federal agency. "I'd like to ask you a few questions about the package you received." Eric nodded, his pulse quickening. "Of course. Anything I can do to help?" Agent Collins motioned toward a chair, and they both sat. The agent opened his briefcase, pulling out a folder and flipping through its contents. "What can you tell me about your connections to international organizations? Any unusual business dealings? Strange visitors?" The question caught Eric off guard. "International organizations? No, I'm just a mechanic. I've got no connections like that." Collins studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Have you ever traveled to Eastern Europe or had dealings with companies based there?" Eric shook his head. "Never. I've barely been out of the state." The agent closed the folder and leaned forward, his gaze intense. "Mr. Parker, the substance found in the package is linked to a network that traffics in restricted materials. It's not just dangerous, it's illegal on an international scale. We believe the sender is using you as a pawn to smuggle this substance into the country." Eric felt the weight of the accusation settle on his shoulders. "But why me? I don't have anything to do with this. I didn't even know the package existed until it showed up at my shop." "That's what we're trying to figure out," Collins replied. "It's possible you were chosen at random, but there's also a chance you were targeted for a specific reason. Have you made any enemies recently? Anyone who might want to implicate you in something like this?" Eric thought back to the disgruntled customer he'd mentioned to Detective Harris. "I told the police about a customer who got upset with me a few weeks ago. He seemed pretty angry, but I can't imagine he'd go this far." Collins made a note in his folder. "We'll look into it. In the meantime, I strongly advise you to stay vigilant. Avoid discussing this case with anyone outside of law enforcement. And if you notice anything unusual, report it immediately." Eric nodded, his mind reeling. The conversation had left him with more questions than answers, and the realization that he was entangled in something much larger than he'd imagined was overwhelming. That evening, Eric and Emily sat down to dinner, the tension between them thick enough to cut with a knife. The normally comforting clatter of silverware on plates felt hollow, their conversation strained. "Do you think they're telling the truth?" Emily asked quietly. "I don't know," Eric admitted. "But if what Agent Collins said is true, then we're dealing with some dangerous people. I just don't understand why they'd choose me." Emily reached across the table, taking his hand in hers. "We'll get through this, Eric. We just have to trust the process." But even as she spoke, a loud knock at the door interrupted their fragile moment of calm. Eric and Emily exchanged a nervous glance before he got up to answer it. Standing on the porch was a delivery driver holding a small package. "Delivery for Eric Parker," the man said, extending the box. Eric's blood ran cold. The last thing he wanted was another mysterious package. "I didn't order anything," he said firmly. "It's already paid for," the driver replied. "Signature required." Reluctantly, Eric signed for the package and brought it inside. Emily stood a few feet away, her arms crossed. "What is it?" she asked, her voice tinged with fear. Eric placed the box on the table and carefully opened it. Inside was a small, unmarked envelope. He opened it to find a USB drive and a note with a single line of text: "The truth is closer than you think." Emily gasped, and Eric's hands trembled as he held the drive. "What do we do?" she whispered. "We take it to the police," Eric said immediately. But curiosity gnawed at him. What if the drive contained answers, something that could explain why he'd been targeted? Against his better judgment, he plugged it into his laptop. The screen flickered to life, displaying a folder labeled Evidence. Inside were several video files, each marked with a date. Eric clicked on the first one, and what he saw made his stomach churn. The footage showed a dimly lit warehouse, where men in lab coats handled vials similar to the one found in his package. The dialogue was muffled, but one phrase stood out clearly: "Shipment confirmed, Eric Parker." Eric's heart raced. "They're framing me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Emily leaned over his shoulder, her eyes wide with disbelief. "But why? What do they want from you?" Before Eric could answer, the screen went black, replaced by a new message: "Stop digging if you value your life." A loud crash from outside made them both jump. Eric rushed to the window and saw a figure running away from the house. The sense of violation was overwhelming. He grabbed his phone and called Detective Harris, who arrived minutes later with a team of officers. Harris listened intently as Eric explained the events, his expression growing grimmer by the second. "This is bigger than we thought," he said. "If they're sending you these kinds of messages, they're not just trying to scare you, they're trying to control you." Eric handed over the USB drive, hoping it would provide the police with the evidence they needed to unravel the mystery. But even as Harris assured him they were making progress, Eric couldn't shake the feeling that the situation was spiraling further out of control. That night, as he lay in bed beside Emily, Eric found himself unable to sleep. Every creak of the house, every rustle of the wind, felt like a threat. He stared at the ceiling, his mind racing with thoughts of what might come next. The following morning, Eric resolved to take matters into his own hands. He couldn't sit idly by while his life was dismantled piece by piece. Armed with the little information he had, he began to dig deeper into the dates on the video files, cross-referencing them with news articles and local events. What he discovered left him reeling. Each date corresponded to a major incident involving illegal substances, chemical spills, stolen shipments, and even a factory explosion. The common thread was a company name that appeared in several reports: Genesis Biotech. Eric's heart raced as he realized the significance. Genesis Biotech was a name he'd heard before, though only in passing. One of their representatives had visited the auto shop months ago, looking for recommendations on fleet maintenance. At the time, it had seemed like an ordinary business inquiry. But now, the pieces began to fall into place. Genesis Biotech wasn't just any company, they were deeply involved in the trafficking of restricted materials. And somehow, Eric had become their scapegoat. Armed with this new lead, Eric contacted Detective Harris, who promised to investigate further. But even as he shared his findings, Eric couldn't escape the nagging feeling that he was being watched. The black sedan reappeared that afternoon, parked down the street from his house. Eric stared at it from the window, his fists clenched. Whoever was behind this wasn't just threatening him, they were closing in. And Eric knew that the only way to survive was to uncover the truth before it was too late. Eric felt the weight of his decision pressing heavily on him as he sat in his living room, staring at the window where the black sedan had parked earlier. His mind raced with thoughts about Genesis Biotech and the possibility that they were behind the plot to frame him. The revelation was unsettling, but it also gave him a sliver of clarity: he needed to act. Sitting idly by would only make things worse. The people targeting him were professionals, meticulous, resourceful, and undoubtedly dangerous. Yet, he was determined not to let them ruin his life. Emily noticed his tension and sat beside him, her presence calming yet filled with her own quiet fear. "What do we do now?" she asked softly, her voice trembling despite her attempt to sound strong. "I'm going to figure this out," Eric said firmly. "But I can't do it alone. I need help, real help." Emily squeezed his hand. "Then let's get it. Whatever you need, Eric, I'm with you." With a deep breath, Eric called Detective Harris again. This time, he pushed harder for more immediate action. "Detective, I've been digging into Genesis Biotech," Eric began, his voice steady but laced with urgency. "There's something off about them. The dates on the USB files match incidents tied to this company, spills, thefts, even an explosion. I think they're the key to all of this." Harris listened intently and promised to escalate the matter to a specialized task force. "But Eric," Harris warned, "you have to be careful. These people are clearly watching you. The more you dig, the more dangerous it gets." "I don't have a choice," Eric replied. "They've already made me a target. I need to clear my name." After ending the call, Eric felt a mix of relief and dread. He knew Harris was trying to help, but time wasn't on his side. If Genesis Biotech was as powerful as he suspected, their reach could easily silence him before the police made any headway. The following day, Eric decided to take a bold step. He remembered the representative from Genesis Biotech who had visited the auto shop months ago, a man named Martin Davis. At the time, Martin had seemed friendly and professional, but Eric now realized that his visit might have been more than it appeared. Using the internet, Eric searched for any information he could find on Martin. It didn't take long to track down a LinkedIn profile and a company email address. Eric debated his next move carefully. Contacting Martin directly was a risk, but he needed answers. He drafted a simple email. Subject: Urgent Inquiry. Message: Martin. We met several months ago at my auto shop when you inquired about fleet maintenance. I need to speak with you about a matter involving Genesis Biotech. It's important and urgent. Please reply as soon as possible. Eric sent the email and waited, his nerves on edge. Hours passed without a response, and his anxiety grew. By evening, he decided to try a different approach. He called the number listed on Martin's profile. To his surprise, Martin answered after just a few rings. "This is Martin Davis." "Martin, this is Eric Parker," he said quickly, his words tumbling out. "I own the auto shop you visited a while back. I need to talk to you about Genesis Biotech." There was a long pause on the other end. When Martin finally spoke, his tone was guarded. "Eric, I don't know what you're talking about." "Yes, you do," Eric pressed. "I've been dragged into something involving your company. I found evidence linking Genesis Biotech to illegal activities, and I think someone there is trying to frame me." Another pause, this one filled with tension. Finally, Martin sighed. "This isn't something we can discuss over the phone. Meet me tomorrow at noon. There's a diner on Main Street called the Crossroads. We'll talk there." "Fine," Eric agreed. "I'll be there." After the call ended, Eric felt a flicker of hope. If Martin was willing to meet, maybe he could provide the answers Eric so desperately needed. The next morning, Eric woke early and prepared for the meeting. He told Emily where he was going, emphasizing that she should stay home and lock the doors while he was gone. She protested at first, wanting to come with him, but Eric insisted it was safer for her to stay behind. As Eric drove to the diner, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He checked his rearview mirror frequently, scanning for the black sedan or any other suspicious vehicles. The streets were busy, filled with the usual morning traffic, but the sense of paranoia lingered. When he arrived at the Crossroads, he parked in the lot and entered the diner, his eyes darting around the room. Martin was already there, sitting in a corner booth with a cup of coffee in front of him. He looked up as Eric approached, his expression serious. "Eric," Martin greeted him, motioning for him to sit. Eric slid into the booth, his heart pounding. "Thanks for meeting me," he said. Martin leaned forward, his voice low. "I don't have much time, so listen carefully. Whatever you think you know about Genesis Biotech, you're not wrong. They're involved in things that would ruin lives if they came to light. But the people running the show, they're untouchable. They have connections everywhere. If they've targeted you, it's because they see you as expendable. Eric's throat tightened. Why me? I'm just a mechanic. What could they possibly want with me? Martin hesitated, glancing around the diner as if checking for eavesdroppers. They use people like you, ordinary, unassuming, to move things under the radar. Packages, money, materials. If something goes wrong, you're the fall guy. No one looks too closely at a mechanic. Eric clenched his fists. I never agreed to any of this. I didn't even know about the package until it showed up at my shop. That doesn't matter to them, Martin said grimly. They've already set the wheels in motion. The question is, how far are you willing to go to stop them? Eric stared at him, the weight of the question sinking in. I'll do whatever it takes, he said finally. Martin nodded. Then you need proof, real proof that ties them to their operations. There's a facility outside of town, officially listed as a storage warehouse. Unofficially, it's where they process and distribute their shipments. If you can get inside and gather evidence, it might be enough to expose them. The idea sent a chill down Eric's spine. Breaking into a facility owned by a powerful and dangerous company was a huge risk. But he also knew it might be his only chance to clear his name. How do I get in? Eric asked. I'll send you the access codes, Martin said. But be careful. If they catch you, you're on your own. Eric nodded, his resolve hardening. I'll do it. After leaving the diner, Eric returned home to prepare. He shared his plan with Emily, who was both terrified and supportive. She helped him pack a small bag with essentials, a flashlight, gloves, a portable camera, and a burner phone for emergencies. That night, under the cover of darkness, Eric drove to the warehouse Martin had described. The building was located in a remote area, surrounded by a tall fence topped with barbed wire. Security cameras dotted the perimeter, their red lights blinking ominously. Eric parked his truck a safe distance away and approached on foot, using the shadows to stay out of sight. When he reached the fence, he input the access code Martin had provided into a keypad near the gate. To his relief, the gate unlocked with a quiet click. Once inside, Eric moved quickly but cautiously, staying close to the walls to avoid detection. The warehouse was massive, with rows of metal shelves stacked high with crates and containers. The air smelled faintly of chemicals, confirming his suspicions about what was stored there. Eric pulled out his camera and began documenting everything he could, labels on crates, security protocols, and any markings that might link the warehouse to Genesis Biotech. He found a crate partially open and peered inside, his stomach churning when he saw vials identical to the one that had been delivered to his shop. Suddenly, footsteps echoed through the building, growing louder with each passing second. Eric ducked behind a stack of crates, holding his breath as two guards walked past, their flashlights sweeping the area. "You hear something?" one of them asked. "Probably just the wind," the other replied. "Let's keep moving." Eric waited until their footsteps faded before continuing his search. He eventually found an office tucked away in a corner of the warehouse. The door was locked, but he managed to pick it using a small tool he'd brought. Inside, he found a desk cluttered with papers and a computer that was still logged in. He took photos of the documents and copied files from the computer onto a USB drive. One file caught his attention. It was a shipment schedule listing locations and contact names, all tied to Genesis Biotech. As he finished, the sound of an alarm shattered the silence. Someone had discovered his presence. Eric grabbed the USB drive and bolted from the office, his heart pounding as he sprinted toward the exit. The guards were in pursuit, their shouts growing louder. Eric reached the fence and scrambled over it just as they opened fire. Bullets whizzed past him, but he kept running until he reached his truck. As he sped away, Eric knew he had narrowly escaped with his life. But he also knew he had something that could finally expose the truth. The question now was whether it would be enough, and whether he could stay alive long enough to use it. Eric's hands trembled as he clutched the USB drive, his grip so tight it felt like the only tether to his sanity. He couldn't afford to let go, not of the drive, not of his resolve. The escape from the warehouse had been harrowing, and the adrenaline coursing through his veins hadn't yet subsided. He pulled into a desolate rest stop miles away from the facility, turned off his headlights, and parked in the shadows. His breathing was shallow, his heart pounding as if it wanted to break free from his chest. Pulling his phone from his pocket, Eric hesitated. Who could he trust now? Harris had been helpful but cautious, unwilling to push too hard without concrete evidence. What Eric now held wasn't just evidence, it was a grenade. If Genesis Biotech learned of its existence, they wouldn't hesitate to do whatever it took to silence him for good. He dialed Harris's number. It rang twice before the detective answered, his tone groggy but alert. "Parker? It's the middle of the night. What's going on?" "I have it," Eric whispered, as if the shadows around him could listen. "Proof. Shipment schedules, names, locations, everything. I barely made it out alive." There was a pause on the other end, then a sharp intake of breath. "Where are you?" Harris asked, his tone shifting to one of urgency. "I'm not saying over the phone. I don't know if they're listening. But I need to get this to you. Now." Harris seemed to understand the gravity of the situation. "Okay. There's a diner off Route 12, about 15 miles north of the city. Meet me there in an hour. And Eric, be careful. Don't trust anyone." Eric hung up and sat in silence for a moment, trying to steel himself for the next leg of the journey. The highway stretched out before him like a long, unblinking eye, its emptiness both a comfort and a threat. He started the truck and merged onto the road, constantly checking his mirrors for any sign of pursuit. The diner came into view just as the horizon began to lighten with the faintest traces of dawn. Its neon sign flickered, casting a dim glow over the parking lot. Eric pulled into a spot near the back, his truck obscured by an overgrown bush. He scanned the area before stepping out, his senses on high alert. Inside, the diner was nearly empty. A tired waitress leaned against the counter, flipping through a magazine, while an older man nursed a cup of coffee at a corner booth. Eric slid into a seat near the window, his back to the wall, and waited. Harris arrived 20 minutes. The exhaustion began to weigh on him, but he couldn't stop moving. Every time he slowed down, he felt exposed, as if unseen eyes were tracking his every move. By late afternoon, he found himself at a rundown motel on the outskirts of a small town. The neon vacancy sign buzzed faintly, and the parking lot was nearly empty. He paid cash for a room and carried his bag inside, locking the door behind him and pulling the curtains shut. The room was dingy, with peeling wallpaper and a faint smell of mildew, but it was quiet. Eric sat on the edge of the bed, his head in his hands. He thought of Emily, alone at home, probably worried sick about him. He wanted to call her, to hear her voice, but Harris's warning echoed in his mind. Instead, he turned on the small TV, hoping to drown out his thoughts. The local news was on, and Eric froze when he saw a familiar face on the screen. It was Martin Davis. The reporter's voice was somber as she announced Martin's death. Authorities are investigating the apparent suicide of Martin Davis, a senior representative at Genesis Biotech. Davis was found in his car early this morning, an apparent victim of carbon monoxide poisoning. Police are treating the case as non-suspicious, but some questions remain unanswered. Eric's blood ran cold. Martin's death was no suicide, it was a message. Genesis Biotech was cleaning house, eliminating anyone who could pose a threat. His phone buzzed, breaking the silence. He hesitated before answering, fearing it might be a trap. But when he saw the caller ID, his heart skipped a beat. It was Emily. Eric, she said, her voice shaking. There's someone outside the house. They've been sitting in a car for hours, just watching. I'm scared. Emily, listen to me, Eric said urgently. You need to leave. Go to your sister's house, or a hotel, anywhere but here. Take only what you need and don't tell anyone where you're going. What about you? She asked, her voice breaking. I'll find you when it's safe, he promised. But right now, you have to trust me. Please, Emily. There was a long pause before she finally agreed. Okay. I'll go. After the call ended, Eric felt a wave of guilt and helplessness. He hated the thought of Emily being alone and afraid, but he knew it was the only way to keep her safe. The next few days were a blur of restless nights and constant vigilance. Eric moved from motel to motel, paying cash and staying under the radar. He avoided using his phone except for brief, encrypted messages to Harris, who provided periodic updates. But the silence from Genesis Biotech was unsettling. Eric knew they wouldn't just let this go, and the waiting was almost worse than the action. He began to feel like a hunted animal, constantly looking over his shoulder, expecting the worst. Then, one night, as he sat in another dingy motel room, his burner phone rang. The number was blocked. Hello, he answered cautiously. Mr. Parker, a voice said, smooth and cold. You've been quite the thorn in our side. Eric's heart raced. Who is this? You know who we are, the voice replied. And you know what we're capable of. We have no interest in hurting you or your family, but you've forced our hand. Return what you've taken, and this can all go away. Eric clenched his fist. I didn't take anything. I'm just trying to protect myself from the mess you dragged me into. There was a low chuckle. Let me be clear, Mr. Parker. This isn't a negotiation. If you don't comply, the consequences will be unfortunate for everyone involved. The line went dead, leaving Eric gripping the phone in frustration and fear. He knew now, more than ever, that he couldn't back down. But the stakes had never been higher, and the odds were stacked against him. As dawn approached, Eric sat in the dim light of the motel room, formulating a plan. He wasn't just going to survive this, he was going to expose Genesis Biotech for the corrupt, ruthless entity it was. Whatever it took, he was ready to fight back. The motel room was dark, save for the faint glow of Eric's laptop screen. He had been working tirelessly for hours, cross-referencing the information from the USB drive Harris had decrypted with what he remembered from his time at Genesis Biotech. The deeper he dove, the more horrifying the revelations became. Genesis wasn't just cutting corners or skirting the law, they were systematically exploiting vulnerable communities, conducting illegal experiments, and silencing anyone who got in their way. Eric felt like he was staring into an abyss. The documents detailed secret labs in remote areas, test subjects who had mysteriously disappeared, and payments funneled to officials to keep it all under wraps. Genesis was a machine that thrived on secrecy, and now he was determined to tear it apart. The phone buzzed next to him, jolting him from his thoughts. It was a secure line Harris had set up for them to communicate. Eric answered quickly, trying to keep his voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. Parker, Harris said, his tone low and urgent. We've made some progress. The cybercrime unit found a goldmine on that drive. Shipment manifests, email chains, even video evidence. This is enough to bury Genesis, but we need to play it smart. If they catch wind of what we're doing, they'll shut everything down and vanish before we can act. What's the plan? Eric asked, his voice tinged with both hope and dread. We're coordinating with federal agents, Harris explained. But these things take time. We need to build an airtight case, one they can't wiggle out of. In the meantime, you need to stay hidden. They're not going to stop coming for you. Eric sighed, running a hand through his hair. They already called me. Made it clear they're willing to do whatever it takes to make this go away. Then you need to keep your head down, Harris said firmly. We're moving as fast as we can, but you can't afford to take risks. Eric nodded, even though Harris couldn't see him. He knew the detective was right, but every instinct in his body screamed at him to act. Sitting still felt like waiting to be hunted, and he wasn't sure how much longer he could take it. After the call ended, Eric sat back in the creaky motel chair, staring at the laptop. He had the information, but Harris and the agents were tied up in bureaucracy. Genesis wasn't waiting, they were already moving. Eric had to find a way to stay ahead of them. He thought of Emily. She was safe, for now, staying with her sister in a neighboring state. Eric hadn't called her since she left, fearing that any contact might lead Genesis to her. The thought of her being dragged into this nightmare was unbearable, and it fueled his resolve to end it as quickly as possible. Hours later, as the sun began to rise, Eric finally formulated a plan. He couldn't sit idly by and hope the authorities would act in time. He needed to go on the offensive, to take the fight to Genesis in a way they wouldn't expect. The first step was to gather allies. Eric thought back to his colleagues at Genesis, the ones who had shown signs of doubt or resistance. Most had been too scared to speak up, but a few had confided in him over the years. He pulled up a list of names and began reaching out, using encrypted messages to avoid detection. One by one, responses trickled in. Some were terse refusals, others vague acknowledgments. But a handful of messages gave him hope. There were people inside Genesis who wanted to see the company brought down, and they were willing to help. Eric coordinated with them, piecing together a clearer picture of Genesis's operations. They confirmed his worst fears. The company had a network of secret facilities scattered across the country, each dedicated to a different aspect of their illegal experiments. Some focused on human trials, others on developing unapproved drugs or weapons. The scale of it was staggering. As Eric worked, the danger around him continued to grow. He noticed strange cars parked near the motels he stayed at, and once, he caught a man in a suit watching him from across the street. Genesis was closing in, and Eric knew it was only a matter of time before they found him. One night, as he packed up to leave yet another motel, his phone buzzed with an alert. It was an encrypted message from one of his contacts inside Genesis. They know where you are. Leave now. Eric didn't hesitate. He grabbed his bag and laptop and bolted for the truck, his heart pounding. As he pulled out of the parking lot, he saw headlights appear behind him. The chase was on. The car behind him gained speed, and Eric knew they weren't ordinary pursuers. Genesis had sent professionals, and they weren't going to let him go without a fight. He swerved onto a side road, hoping to lose them in the maze of back streets, but they stayed on his tail. Eric's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as he took sharp turns, his tires screeching on the asphalt. He needed to think fast. Up ahead, he spotted a construction site and veered toward it, weaving between equipment and piles of debris. The car behind him struggled to keep up, but it wasn't enough to shake them. As he reached the edge of the site, Eric spotted a narrow alleyway just wide enough for his truck. He gunned the engine and squeezed through, scraping the sides of his vehicle but emerging on the other side. The pursuing car couldn't follow, and Eric heard the sound of screeching brakes and a crash as they failed to stop in time. He didn't wait to see the aftermath. He kept driving, his mind racing as he tried to figure out his next move. He couldn't keep running forever. Finally, he reached the outskirts of a large city and found a crowded parking garage where he could abandon the truck. He wiped it down for fingerprints and grabbed his bag, blending into the throng of people on the streets. Eric checked into a small hostel under a fake name, using cash to avoid leaving a trail. He knew it was only a temporary solution, but it gave him a moment to breathe and regroup. The next day, he received a call from Harris. "We're moving in," the detective said. "The evidence you provided was enough to secure warrants. We're hitting Genesis's main offices and a few of their known facilities simultaneously. But it's going to be messy. They won't go down without a fight. Eric felt a surge of relief but also apprehension. The battle was far from over. "What do you need from me?" he asked. "Stay safe," Harris replied. "We'll take it from here." But Eric couldn't just sit back and wait. He had one last ace up his sleeve, a whistleblower within Genesis who had access to the company's most sensitive files. This person, known only by the alias Shadow, had been feeding Eric information for weeks. Now, it was time to make their final move. Eric and Shadow coordinated a plan to release the damning evidence to the public. They prepared a massive data dump that would expose Genesis's crimes in vivid detail, ensuring that even if the authorities faltered, the world would know the truth. On the night of the operation, Eric sat in a dimly lit internet cafe, his laptop connected to multiple encrypted servers. He watched as the files uploaded, each percentage tick bringing him closer to justice. But then, the lights flickered. Eric's pulse quickened as he realized something was wrong. The cafe door swung open, and two men in suits stepped inside, scanning the room. Eric didn't wait to see what they would do. He grabbed his laptop and bolted for the back exit, his heart pounding. The men shouted and gave chase, but Eric had planned for this. He darted through narrow alleys, using the city's labyrinthine layout to his advantage. Finally, he reached a safe house Harris had arranged, slipping inside just as the upload completed. The files were live, spreading across the internet and making their way to journalists, activists, and anyone who could amplify the message. The fallout was immediate. News outlets picked up the story within hours, and Genesis Biotech found itself under intense scrutiny. Protests erupted outside their offices, and their stock plummeted. Executives were arrested, and the company's operations ground to a halt. For the first time in weeks, Eric felt a glimmer of hope. He knew the fight wasn't over. Genesis still had powerful allies and resources, but they were no longer untouchable. As he sat in the safe house, exhausted but triumphant, his phone buzzed with a message from Emily. "I saw the news. I'm so proud of you. Come home when it's safe. I love you." Tears welled up in Eric's eyes as he read her words. He had survived the storm, but more importantly, he had struck a blow against the darkness. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he believed that justice was possible.